Understanding the government that the founders established requires understanding the government that the founders inherited. To a certain degree, we have glimpsed it at work in England in the 16th and 17th centuries. The original colonists brought with them a governmental system with their own reference points. Executive power lodged in a king, legislative power lodged in a parliament, judicial power lodged in a bench. But even these simple divisions of governmental power were overlaid and complex in England, and, as we have seen, arguing over their precise boundaries led to conflict and even war in England. In their colonial transplanted form, they mutated even more. In this lecture, we will consider the structure of colonial government, its origins, and its major moments of transition. It is perhaps useful to begin historically. Let us go back to the date 1560. There was, as of yet, no English colonization scheme. Henry VII had authorized John Cabot to sail in search of a northwest passage in 1497, and this voyage had produced the notable discovery of one of the world's great fisheries, the Grand Banks, along with the island of Newfoundland, pictured here. But the tight-fisted Henry VII refused to speculate in colonial adventures, and explorers turned to other European courts for funding. It is ironic, given that the English would later be so successful at colonization, that in the 16th century the entire North American coastline would be explored by the Spanish, and that the French would eventually export fish from the Grand Banks to England. It was not until the later 16th century that explorers convinced Queen Elizabeth to sponsor several trips to the New World. Colonization schemes in the Elizabethan era were part of an aggressive expansion brought on by the quickening economic pace across Europe. The discovery of the New World injected gold and silver into the European economy, along with a variety of desirable New World products. Simultaneously, the manufacture of European finished goods created new wealth inside many countries, including those, like England, which did not capitalize directly off of the New World trade. One of the results was the investment of this new income into an expanded global trade. At first, of course, this involved the trade to continental Europe. Merchant adventurers were the first to monopolize this trade. Most of the adventurers looked to European and Eastern markets. It was up to a few daring explorers to look to the New World. Chief among them, at least for England, was Sir Walter Raleigh. Okay, here he is. I cut to him a little bit too early. But this was Sir Walter Raleigh, and he was largely an independent force, and he really achieved what he did because of his direct relationship with the Queen. Here's Sir Walter Raleigh as played by Clive Owen in the movie Elizabeth the Golden Age. But these adventures, by the way, and Sir Walter Raleigh would establish a colony in the New World, did not establish successful colonies. Sir Walter Raleigh's colony actually disappeared. The more successful merchants traded to the east. The first big success was the Levant Company, formed in 1581. It traded to Turkey and to the eastern Mediterranean, which essentially was everything between Egypt and Persia. The third was the East India Company, formed primarily by Levant Company merchants in 1600. Trading companies were essentially protective associations. One way of thinking about them is to ask a basic question. Why bother to get a license from the crown to conduct business? Let's start with the question of authority. All subjects of the king who wanted to leave the realm of England needed permission, and all trade had to be licensed. For centuries, the various trades, everything from tailors to grocers to shoemakers, were monopolized within a guild system. The purpose of the guild system was twofold. First, it ensured quality. It established an apprenticeship program. It ensured quality in the passage of skills from one generation to the next, and made sure that those practicing a certain trade, it was called a mystery, by the way, knew what they were doing. And there were significant fines for practicing the mystery of shoemaking without being a member of the Shoemakers Guild. It stood to reason, of course, in this, that those that actually made their money this way would make more money if there were fewer of them. And it's very important to understand then that the second purpose of a guild is to artificially restrict the number of people in a particular trade. In this way, you're not just ensuring quality, but you're ensuring that there's only a limited number of people that you can get your shoes from, or your groceries from, or whatever the case may be. So in this way, guilds maintained a kind of artificial scarcity and thus kept the price of finished goods artificially high. The East India Company and the Levant Company, and later colonial trading companies as well, all sought this same kind of recognition from the crown and largely for the same purpose. The charters that the crown granted to them contained the following privileges. First, it created, out of all the investors in the company, a single fictive legal person, that is, the corporation. This allowed all the members of the company to avoid individual liability for the collective company's actions. It also gave security to investors who were investing in the company. Second, it authorized the company to trade to a given area, the Levant or the East Indies in these cases. It also gave them a monopoly of that trade. This monopoly sheltered the trading company from competition, providing a further security for the investment being made. In exchange for these privileges, the merchants promised to govern the trade. Merchants who wanted in were to be allowed in and then regulated by the trading companies. These joint stock trading company charters were quite similar in nature, and they provided a familiar form of governance for the company, a single governor and a council. Together, the governor and council were authorized to make the rules and regulation for the conduct of the trade. Of course, those rules had to be in conformity with English law, but otherwise, this was a significant delegation of authority. With this power came the right to fine people subject to the company, as well as to admit people to the company or expel people from the company. So the trading companies were both public and private, although we must emphasize here that this is modern and not medieval or early modern language. Authority in the ancien regime was not conceived of in public or private terms. Everything came from the king and from custom, and private power was always licensed by explicit or implicit reference to these legal sources. Nonetheless, it is useful to think of these companies as both private and public in their makeup. They were an extension of the crown. As such, they were governed by it and were subject to its authority. At the same time, the trading companies were bastions of private privilege. They were monopolies that sometimes amassed tremendous wealth and made fortunes for its directors and its stockholders. But, as we will see, the private and public connection kept these companies closely tied to the crown. The first joint stock trading company to the New World was the Virginia Company. It was formed by many of the East India and Levant Company merchants. They were looking for new investment opportunities. And in fact, the first governor of the Virginia Company was also the governor of the East India Company. These directors promoted the company, devising a planting scheme, raised funds, and applied to the king for a charter, which was granted in 1606. The following year, the ship set sail for Chesapeake Bay. There is much to learn from this first experience of governance, not the least of which is that each colonial experience was unique. Although we can generalize in many ways about the structure of colonial governance and the common inheritance of the common law and even the English customary law, the experience of colonial life was different in each region, if not each colony. In Virginia, the context of colonial settlement was one of brutality and mortality. Mortality was shockingly high in the colony in its early years, so much so that without a constant influx of colonists from 1607 to 1630, the colony would have perished. The fact that there were so many people willing to go to the New World spoke both of the successful marketing back in England and outright illegal deceit. To recruit labor to the New World, desperate people were promised their own land for service equal to a term of years. Mendicants and orphans and drunkards were also kidnapped, although we can never know in terms of numbers how many ended up stolen from the port cities of England. But shocking mortality and brutality held labor only worked within a but shocking mortality and brutality and holding labor in this way only worked within a legal system and a political system of intense oppression. Among the first settlers, most, if not all, were willing migrants who faced mortality rates of 50 to 90%. They kept coming, but dissension within the fort built at Jamestown made governance difficult. In order to make authority more clear, the company applied for new charters from the crown and received them in 1609 and in 1612. The 1612 charter provided for more stockholder control and increased the company's ability to raise money through lotteries. The first laws arrived with the Governor Dale after having been approved by the Virginia Council resident in England. The governor and council in England had appointed a local governor and council there, but their authority was impinged by the true chartered authority back in England. In any case, the growth of the colony in the 16 teens led to a conflict between the company elites and the settlers themselves. The root of this conflict was power and interest. The company needed profit to pay dividends to the stockholders. Their schemes to achieve this repeatedly ran into the desires of settlers to acquire property themselves. It resulted in several deliberate reorganizations of property law and ownership, with the company ultimately relinquishing its monopoly of ownership over the land in 1614. Before this time, all land was technically owned by the company, and all the crops grown or products made were to be turned over to it. After 1614, the company allowed people to work their own land. Large land grants followed, as did the arrangement where people paying for their own travel to the New World would be granted 100 acres of land. These were known as head rights. In 1618, the company proposed to replace the military laws with free laws, which His Majesty's subjects live under in England. Governor George Yardley wrote, quote, "So that the inhabitants might have a hand in governing of themselves, it was granted that a general assembly should be held yearly, fonts whereat were to be present the governor and council, with 2 burgesses from each town or plantation, freely to be elected by the inhabitants thereof. This assembly to have power to make and ordain whatsoever laws and orders should by them be thought good and profitable for our subsistence." End quote. So America's first representative institution was established in 1618. In 1619, Virginia put forward its first law code. People flowed into Virginia, upwards of 2,000 by 1622. The population stretched along the James River, quickly intruding on Indian territory. War broke out between the Algonquin Indians and English settlers in the Chesapeake Bay in 1622, with initially disastrous consequences for the settlers. The Virginia Company did not support the settlers, and the king ultimately called the company to account. The king granted the charter, and the king could revoke it. But to do so would disturb vested rights, and as such, the king could not simply rescind the charter by his own mere motion. So his officers began legal proceedings. The Crown instituted quo warranto proceedings against the company. A writ of quo warranto asks by what authority somebody claims to hold an office or exercise some power. So when the Crown called the Virginia Company into court to show by what authority it exercised power in Virginia, the company produced the charter. The Crown's lawyers then argued that the charter had been violated and that was thus void. The judges agreed and the charter was revoked. Thereafter, the king appointed the governor and the council. James did retain the House of Burgesses, but he stipulated that his privy council must ratify all legislation. This model would become the model for all of the other colonies. Nonetheless, we should not impute a single trajectory of colonial development. The position of Massachusetts in this case is instructive. The Massachusetts Bay Company was founded by Puritan merchants who, every bit as much as those who were invested in the Virginia Company, wanted to see a profit in its New World venture. But the Puritans had another mission as well. Distressed with the progress of reform in England, many believed that the settlement of a New World colony would provide a spiritual opportunity. It was an opportunity to establish a model colony. As John Winthrop, the colony's first governor, put it, it would be like a city upon a hill. The model would be a model not for the New World, but for the Old. Remember to put this along our timeline of Tudor-Stuart history. The colony was founded in the 1630s, during a period when King Charles I was elevating high church Anglicans and removing Puritans from power. He was also governing without Parliament and maximizing feudal revenues in ways that skirted constitutional norms. For many Puritans, the New World model would become a refuge. Over 10,000 would flood into the region in the 1630s. It was the first of many great migrations in American history. But the Puritan character of New England must not be too much exaggerated. First off, not just Puritans migrated there. Colonial leaders needed to balance their trade, and this was extremely difficult given that New England soils did not produce a staple crop for export. The soil was simply too poor. It could barely coax enough food from its soils to feed the population that was there. To turn profits, colonial leaders turned to shipbuilding, harvesting the vast reserves of timber in New England. This required labor, and there weren't enough Puritans to fill it. Likewise, migration brought an influx of money. The colony became wealthy, but only because it relied upon a flow of one-time capital infusions brought by migrants. An important part of understanding New England's history is that it never produced a staple agricultural crop or a cash crop of any kind. Colonial leaders turned to shipbuilding and trade to bring in money, but they were repeatedly starved for capital. They recognized that migration brought that capital, and so they repeatedly loosened restrictions on immigration and brought in new people. This often pushed Puritans out of Massachusetts Bay and into other regions. In fact, it creates a whole cycle of cultural anxiety for Puritans, which I personally find fascinating. These communities begin as very rigorously Calvinist and very tightly disciplined. Then they become less so, both because of generational divides — parents are always complaining that their children are lazy good-for-nothings, or vice versa, actually — and because of migration. And so what we see is what Puritans call declension, that is, the declining of traditional Calvinist values. Usually, long periods of declension were followed by acute social and cultural crises, and some kind of rebirth. Thus, we see witches appearing in Salem at the end of a long period of declension, and then a great awakening in the early 18th century. But I digress. As you read the documents for this week, looking at the developments of governing institutions in New England, think about how these internal dynamics affected the imperial dynamics. We can think about some major currents in the historical development of institutions in the colonies, especially as they regard sovereignty. First, and perhaps most importantly, colonists all understood themselves to be freeborn English. They were not united on what this meant, which means we must read the documents closely to understand it, but they all believed it, and it was enshrined, by the way, in the charters. Second, all colonial authority emanated from the crown. It was not until the 18th century that Parliament granted a colonial charter. This would have great consequences in the 18th century constitutional debate that erupted over taxation, which we will discuss in a few weeks. Third, the British did develop several lines of explicit authority over the colonies. One was direct Crown supervision, as evidenced by the repeal of Virginia's charter. The second was as a court of last appeal, judicially speaking. One could always appeal a decision from the highest courts of a colony to the Privy Council. However, remember that just because one could appeal does not mean that it was feasible. Think of the expense, if nothing else. The third was the Crown's asserted right to review the laws passed by colonial assemblies. This was more direct control, and it was exercised on many occasions. A fourth way was through parliamentary legislation. Beginning in the 1650s, Parliament began to assert its will in order to shore up a unified mercantile empire. It passed the first of a number of navigation acts. No one legitimately disputed the right of the Crown and Parliament to govern the colonies in these ways. At various points, colonists would dispute the limits of supervisory power, or resist regulation, or just flat out disobey the law. To take one example, Massachusetts barely escaped King Charles's attempt to revoke the charter in the late 1630s, primarily because of the outbreak of war with Scotland and then the resulting civil war in England in the 1640s. To take another, smugglers regularly ignored the navigation acts, trading openly with the French in the West Indies and then avoiding customs in the colonial port cities. But many colonists at the same time supported the Navigation Acts, in part because the Navigation Acts gave them a competitive advantage to British trading vessels trading with England. And colonial ships were on par with those that were made back in England. The Navigation Acts also created a ready market for staple items like rice, tobacco, and wheat, as well as a preference for British over French and Spanish staples. So for a long time, regulation was both welcomed and resisted within the colonies, and the British government proved willing to overlook smuggling provided the system was making everyone rich. As we will see, it was only over a very specific historical event that the system was strained to breaking in the 18th century.